Hello and welcome to another episode of Virginia Wine and Song, the Virginia YouTube channel, Virginia Wine YouTube channel, where we pair a Virginia wine slash winery with what I consider to be underrated albums or underrated pieces of pop music from the classic era, which I have defined from 1964 to 1999. A lot of good music came out prior to 1964, and a lot of good music has come out since '99. But for my definition of the classic rock era or the classic pop era, 1964 to 1999 is what I focus on. So I pair the wine from Virginia with traditionally an underrated album. But today's July 4th. Today's July 4th, 2025, Independence Day. So I'm going to be talking about records or albums that are not necessarily underrated, because we're going to be celebrating American rock and roll here. So it's going to be a fun episode. I'll try to move a little quicker than normal. I always say that, and I end up going longer than expected. So I'm going to try to be a little more brisk because I talk about the wine and the winery first. And the winery I'm going to be talking about today kind of goes in line with the theme of Americana. And the reason why it goes into the theme of Americana is because this wine is called Black Bear Red. Black Bear Red, and this is actually from the Shenandoah Valley series. Shenandoah Valley, which is America, right? It's a national park, and it's a vital part of the state of Virginia, and that happens to be where I live at the moment. So this is a wine from a winery called Ducard. Ducard Winery is located in Madison County, Virginia. Pretty close proximity to Shenandoah National Park. If you are familiar with the Sperryville area of Virginia, Rappahannock County, you go maybe about 13 miles from Sperryville, kind of southwest of Sperryville. You'll enter Madison County and you end up very close to this little crossroads called Etlan, E-T-L-A-N, Etlan, Virginia. And you drive another 3 miles almost into the mountains, really. I mean, it's probably, of all the wineries that are in Virginia that I've been to, at least, this one is like really, you feel you're in the mountains. In fact, I think they even have their own weather system at this winery because they're so close to the jagged mountains there of the Blue Ridge. It's great. It's a great winery. There's no internet there, so if you want to work there, you probably won't be able to because there's no internet, and that's a good thing. You don't want to work usually when you go to a winery. This is Black Bear Red. And this is a Virginia table. I wouldn't call it a table wine. It's a blend. It's a blend of a couple of different varietals. I would say it's probably Cab Franc, Merlot, and Petit Verdot. And if they're watching the video, they can correct me in the comments. But I think that's the blend: Cab Franc, Cab Franc, Petit Verdot, and Merlot. So now that we're talking about the winery Ducard, they have other things, of course, besides this blend. They also have something called a Shenandoah White, and that's their white version of the Shenandoah Valley theme here. And it's an off-dry white, so that means it's got a touch of sweetness. I can still drink it. I tried it. I like it, especially on a hot day in the middle of the summer. Shenandoah White is very, very good. What else do they have at this winery? Well, they have the usual suspects: Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, not Pinot Grigio, Pinot Gris, which is the French version of Pinot Grigio. They have Viognier. They have, the usual ones that you see at Virginia wineries. They have a rosé, and I believe the rosé is pretty dry. Yeah, it's a dry rosé. And they have Merlot and Cab Franc and Petit Verdot. And I believe, because those are the big reds they have, that's what they've used to blend for this wine here called Virginia Red Wine. Ducard Winery, definitely worth checking out. There are a couple other wineries along the way that you can stop by on your way to Ducard. And I'll talk about those other wineries probably in a later episode. But anyway, I highly recommend this. And the last thing I'll say about the winery before I go into the music, they have a satellite tasting room now, which is in Luray. It's about a mile south of downtown Luray, and it's called Stover Hall. Stover Hall is actually a wedding venue, an events venue. It's right off of Business Route 340. You can't miss it. When their tasting room is open for wine tastings, they have the flags out that say tastings today. But because they were also a wedding venue, a lot of times they're not open to the public because they have a wedding going on there. But you definitely can check it out if you happen to be in Luray and you see the flags are out saying tastings today. Stop by because they offer a selection of these wines from Ducard, and this is where Black Bear is featured. You can also get the Shenandoah White, which is that off-dry white there. I think they also, at the moment, they also have the Chardonnay for sale. They may even have the Viognier. I think they do mix it up whenever you go there, but I highly recommend checking out Stover Hall as well. If you can't quite make it over to Madison County, then Luray is a good alternative, especially if you're coming from Northern Virginia and you have a later start than you expected. It may be harder for you to get down to Madison, but at some point, do check out the winery Ducard because you really do feel like you're away from it all. I mean, the fact that they don't have internet there is a good thing, I think, because you don't want to be tied to your job or your iPhone when you're there, surrounded by this wonderful scenery. And the last thing I'll say about the winery, the Ducard winery, is they have a big field in the back. They have a lot of live music there. And in the field, they actually have a tulip field, tulip meadow. And in the springtime, if you go there, all the tulips are in bloom. And it's really something to see, all those tulips out there. So I highly recommend going to Ducard. You can't go wrong. Like I said, you're not going to be surprised with any of the wines they have. They have the Virginia standards. So the 4th of July, okay? So I try to marry the wine with the music, but this time, because it's the 4th of July, I'm not going to focus on just one album. I'm going to focus on 4 albums. And these are 4 albums that represent pretty much the entire U.S., from West Coast to East Coast. So I try to pick bands and artists that are from those parts of the country. So I'm going to start with the left coast or the West Coast, California, and then I'm going to move over towards the East Coast. I only have 4 albums to feature, so it's kind of limited. Not every part of the country is going to be represented, but I think I have a good selection here to choose from. So we're going to start with the West Coast, which is Americana rock from California. I could have picked the Beach Boys, but I already featured the Beach Boys in a special segment that I did following Brian Wilson's passing. So I'm going to talk about Huey Lewis and the News. And if you were around in the 80s, you definitely knew about Huey Lewis and the News. They are Americana. Their roots, they're kind of a garage-like roots, gutsy kind of soul and rhythm and blues band. They kind of got lumped into the pop era of the 80s because they had a couple of hits that were really poppy. But the first couple of Huey Lewis albums are really kind of rootsy, especially the first album they did, the first 2 albums they did. This is their 3rd album, which is Sports. This came out in 1983. And it's a classic. I mean, all I can say is American Psycho. If you saw the movie, you know what I'm talking about. This does not have Hip to Be Square on it. That's from the album that came out after this. This album has a lot of hits, though. It's almost in a weird way a quasi-greatest hits for them. And it's just a fun record. It's a fun record to listen to in any kind of environment when you're sipping on good wine or even beer, whatever. It's called Sports because they are obviously, they were trying to go for that bar band feel, and they definitely pull it off. The songs that were not hits, like The Bad Is Bad, which actually got airplay on the radio, but it wasn't really a hit. I love that song because the lyrics are so relatable for anybody who's been in a relationship that's gone sour. It's a great song. You Crack Me Up is on here, and Honky Tonk Blues. I mean, these are bluesy songs, and they are from San Francisco. And this is not a band. When you think of San Francisco, you think of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane and CCR and all these kind of bands that defined the late 60s and early 70s. But Journey was also from the Bay Area, as is Huey Lewis and the News. So this is the Sports album. And the hits on here are The Heart of Rock and Roll, Heart and Soul, I Want a New Drug, Walking on a Thin Line, and If This Is It. So that's quite a few. Those are quite a few hits from one album. And this is the original pressing from the 80s. It's not a remaster. It's on the Chrysalis label. I always, whenever you go to a record store, a used record store, be sure you inspect the vinyl just to make sure. They do a pretty good job at used record stores to make sure the vinyl is okay, but you know, you just want to check it yourself if you can. All right, so that's California. We're going to move on now to the Midwest. I'm going to get on this imaginary jet plane and go from San Francisco, and we're going to fly over the heartland, and we're going to land in Indiana. And you probably have, if you know anything about rock music and pop music from the 80s, you probably know who I'm going to talk about now, because Indiana, we're going to fly into Indianapolis, we're going to rent a car and go down to Bloomington or Seymour, Indiana, and we're going to talk about John Cougar Mellencamp, Scarecrow. And John Cougar Mellencamp is a very interesting case because he got really popular in the early 80s, right around the time that MTV was starting to form. And the first couple of albums he did, he was just named John Cougar. In fact, I think he was even called Johnny Cougar on his first album. His second album, he just was called John Cougar, and then I think the third album, which was the album American Fool, which had Jack and Diane on it, that was a huge hit album. He was still called John Cougar. That album did so well, and he started to become very prominent on MTV, that he started to kind of insist on being known as Mellencamp, because that's his real name. So this album an album came out in 1983 called Aha, and that was the first album that he was known as John Cougar Mellencamp. This was the follow-up to Aha, and this is called Scarecrow, also John Cougar Mellencamp. He became just plain John Mellencamp, I think. Maybe the album after this, or the album he did in '89, I can't remember really. But I picked Scarecrow just because it really is I could have picked the Lonesome Jubilee or even the album before it, American Fool, because he has a real brand of storytelling, kind of similar to Bruce Springsteen, but more heartland related, more Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, that part of the heartland. His songs are kind of, they talk about economic woes of that part of the country. And he does it all with his great back rhythm section on it. He's got some great musicians on here. This album, Scarecrow, really defines Americana rock, I think, from that era, from 1985. And it's got, of course, Small Town. A lot of people thought he was trying to emulate Bruce Springsteen, these songs about growing up in these small towns. But, that's what he knew. And Lonely Old Night was on this album, and Rumble Seat. And the non-hits on here, Justice and Independence 85, great song to listen to on Independence Day. Again, these songs are not overtly political, they're not overtly talking about the economic woes, but they are, in a way, because he was very he had a conscience. He really cared about the people in his state who are being affected by Reaganomics, and also a lot of the manufacturing jobs are being shipped overseas. So he was affected by that. He wrote about it. He sang about it. Rumble Seat is another one. Kind of talks about growing up in the '60s and having a car with a rumble seat. And of course, ROCK in the USA is on here. So it is a rah-rah, kind of a rah-rah America, but here's also America that we need to talk about. He was involved with Farm Aid. Farm Aid, of course, was that series of concerts that they raised money for farmers that were in need in the Midwest and all over the country, actually. Willie Nelson was involved with Farm Aid, and I think Little Steven was as well, and of course John Cougar Mellencamp. So this is him, and this was coming after Aha and American Fool, where they were considered to be in his first album. Maybe it was the second album, the one that has Ain't Even Done with the Night. I think that was his second album. Those were kind of like rock albums. He was just doing pop and rock songs like Jack and Diane. And Hurt So Good. But this was the album where the album before this was when he became kind of more politically motivated, and that's really what he wanted to do to begin with. So this is the inner sleeve. Not much to see on the inner sleeve, but this was the last album that he did on this label called Riva. Riva was a small independent label based, I think, in the Midwest, and he ended up getting a contract deal, a contract with Mercury Records for the album that came out after this, which was Lonesome Jubilee, which I almost picked, because Lonesome Jubilee is almost kind of a sequel, I think, to Scarecrow. It's very similar in its tone. I think Scarecrow is better. But I think because of the studio they had with Mercury, the Lonesome Jubilee is slicker, has a more produced sound. But I kind of like the raw sound of Scarecrow, so I picked Scarecrow. So that is Indiana. Okay, we're gonna get back. We're gonna pour us another glass of Black Bear Red, and we're gonna get in our imaginary jet now, and we're gonna fly into Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, I really thought about picking. I wanted to pick a blue-eyed. I wanted to pick a Philly soul band, but I really don't have any Philly soul albums in my collection. I need to correct that very soon. I need to get some Spinners, or I need to get some Philly soul. Barry White is kind of Philly soul. Philly soul is similar to Motown, but more symphony based. They use more stringed instruments. They have the lush orchestra stuff like TSOP, the theme song for Soul Train. That's Philly soul. Like the Stylistics, Philly soul, the Delphonics. So all those, I have a lot of their stuff on CDs, but I don't have any albums by those bands. I need to fix that. But I do have Blue-Eyed Soul, or White Man Soul, and that would be Hall & Oates. And I picked this album, Abandoned Luncheonette, because can you get any more Americana than a diner, a classic diner in the shape of a train car? And these were the diners they had back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They looked like train cars. There's still a couple of these things open, kind of scattered throughout the country in small town USA. But this is an abandoned luncheonette. This album came out in 1973. And this was the one and only album that Hall & Oates had on Atlantic. Actually, I take that back. I think they had an album before this on Atlantic called Whole Oats. And that album sold nothing. So Atlantic signed them for the next album, which is Abandoned Luncheonette, this one here. And this one did okay. It didn't sell very good. I think Atlantic had high hopes for it. And this is 73 when Led Zeppelin was all the rage, and hard rock and Black Sabbath and all these other bands were really, really becoming popular. Or they were popular in the 60s, but they really kind of exploded in the early 70s. And these guys they kind of faded away into the plaster of the abandoned luncheonette that they're singing about here. So Atlantic dropped them. Atlantic Records dropped Hall & Oates after this album. And this album is a great album. It should be remastered. I think it's been remastered a couple of times. I don't have any of the remasters, but this is a used copy that I picked up at a used record store. And it's got a very young Daryl Hall and John Oates in the back, and they're sitting at the abandoned luncheonette, drinking an imaginary cola or whatever they're talking about. And this is, of course, is the inner sleeve. The album is in good shape. It's got it's on Atlantic. So it's hard to believe that Atlantic dropped them. And I'm sure they were kicking themselves because the albums that came out after this album were increasingly more popular. And of course, Hall & Oates became this huge hit-making machine in the 80s, and they were on RCA. They were on RCA records from 1974 all the way to 1988. And that was when they had all their hits. So Atlantic is probably saying, oh my gosh, what did we do? We should have kept them. Yeah, they screwed up. No question about it, Atlantic, you screwed up. But this album does have a hit on it. She's Gone made its first appearance on this album. And She's Gone was not a hit until a couple of years later. This album came out in 73, and She's Gone wasn't a hit on the radio until 1976. I want to say 76. Sarah Smile was on an album that came out after this, and that was a hit. And Atlantic said, okay, we're going to go ahead and throw this single out there, She's Gone. And that became a hit. It was an Atlantic release, but they did get a little bit of Hall & Oates action, even though the single was released after this album came out, like 3 years after the album came out. And then Rich Girl came out, and then we know the rest is history. But this is a great mellow listen. This is just a good kind of a mellow album to listen to. It's got She's Gone, of course, Laughing Boy, How Had I Known You Better Then, Lady Rain. John Oates actually sings on quite a few songs on this album. The song Abandoned Luncheonette is a real song about Americana, so I highly recommend this. If you find this album, I don't know why they haven't remastered it. Like I said, I think they remastered it in Japan, and I think they remastered it in Germany, but they have yet to do an American remaster. MoFi or Analog Productions needs to get right on that and fix that, because this would sound great as a remaster. Okay, so we are in Philly, so we're going to hop back on our plane. And I could have picked Bruce Springsteen, I could have picked Bob Seger. They were kind of obvious to me. So was John Cougar Mellencamp, I guess, but I didn't pick Bruce Springsteen because I want to go a little bit south. I want to get on this airplane or train, even get on a train or even a car, because we're going to go to Virginia. We're going to drive or fly or take the train to Virginia. And I wish I had Dave Matthews. I don't have any Dave Matthews. He's actually not from Virginia initially. He's from South Africa. He settled in Virginia. So the Virginia band I'm going to be talking about here is another Bruce Hornsby. Bruce Hornsby and the Range. This is Scenes from the South Side. And this was their second album. Their first album was The Way It Is, which of course has the song The Way It Is on it. This album, I think, is a little bit more representative. I think this album represents Virginia and Appalachia and the problems of the Middle Atlantic, not just Virginia, but also Maryland and North Carolina and West Virginia, because we were having economic problems back then too, especially the people who relied on the land for farming, and also the watermen who were working on the Chesapeake Bay. There's a song on here called "Look Out Any Window," which is all about the plight of the crabbers on the Chesapeake Bay. Not just the crabbers, but the fishermen, the fishing industry in general. So it's also a fun record. It's got a couple of great songs on here about just having fun. There's a song on here called "The Old Playground," which is about an old basketball court that Bruce Hornsby was a basketball player. He's really tall. If you've ever seen pictures of him, or if you've seen him in concert, he's over 6 feet tall. So he's sitting at this piano. You know, you see him behind a piano most of the time, but he gets up. And then when I first saw him in concert, I was like, wow, this guy's tall. He played basketball. No surprise there. He played basketball also for William and Mary. He went to William and Mary in Virginia. And he wrote a lot of the songs with his brother John. A song on here that he wrote that's on this album is Jacob's Ladder. And he wrote that song in the mid-'80s, and he gave that song to Huey Lewis. Huey Lewis put that on his album 4, and it was a hit. It was a #1 hit for Huey Lewis. This album came out 2 years after the album 4 came out, and Bruce Hornsby covered his own song, basically. He did Jacob's Ladder, and it's on this album. There's a live version he does of Jacob's Ladder that's on his greatest hits that I think is even better than the studio version. But this album is, I prefer it. I mean, I like the way it is. I really, really like A Night in the Town. A Night in the Town came out in 1990. That was definitely a different sound for Bruce Hornsby. But this was the first album he did after The Way It Is, so he had enough money in his coffers to make a real good record. He didn't do just a repeat of The Way It Is, although The Way It Is has songs on there as well about the plight of people in Virginia, and especially the fishermen and the people who live in Appalachia. This album is a little bit more obvious with that. There's one song on here that was a hit. It was a top 5 hit called "The Valley Road," and it's actually one of his signature songs. And it's a very dark song. If you listen to the song, I won't give the topic away because the topic is kind of provocative and politically charged. But "The Valley Road" is about a young girl in Appalachia who ends up having a problem and what she does to rectify that problem. Pretty dark stuff. So this album is Americana for sure. So let's review them. We got Bruce Hornsby and the Range, Songs from the South Side. I'm sorry, Scenes from the South Side. Scenes from the South Side, not Songs from the South Side. I'm thinking about Songs of the Big Chair. We have Daryl Hall and John Oates with Abandoned Luncheonette. And we have John Cougar Mellencamp, Scarecrow, Rain on the Scarecrow, a great angry song about a farmer who's about to lose his farm because he doesn't make enough money in crops to pay his taxes. And then you have Huey Lewis, The News with Sports. Kind of all these albums that I just reviewed, well, Abandoned Luncheonette is really not that heavy either. The heavy ones, the ones with material that's a little more politically charged, obviously are John Cougar Mellencamp and Bruce Hornsby. The more fun, kind of just sit back and enjoy and have a good time would be definitely Sports, but also Abandoned Luncheonette by Hall & Oates. So have some of your black bear. It sounds like I've had some of this already, but I haven't. The cork is still on it. Black bear red, not blackberry, although blackberry red sounds pretty good too. I will talk to you soon. Have a nice 4th.